George Washington knew a good thing when he saw it. He visited this stately home here in Laurel, Maryland. Welcome to a lesson in history. Specifically, welcome to Montpelier, home to famous colonial families and a resting spot for even more famous visitors.
Abigail Adams liked Montpelier so much that she returned often to this home that was synonymous with gracious living and warm hospitality. When leaving Montpelier, the First Lady would make her way back to Washington on paths that could only generously be called roads. Historic Route 1 developed along these colonial paths, becoming a toll road in 1813 and eventually linking Maine to Florida. But it was its passage through Prince George's County that made the history books. It was, in fact, the busiest thoroughfare in the world. The towns of Route 1 is our theme today as we take a look at industrial centers, streetcar towns, port cities, and places where blood was shed in the name of honor and liberty.
Before we hit the road, let's linger a moment at this idyllic spot. Montpelier was built in the 1780s by Major Thomas Snowden and still continues to draw rave reviews for its exquisite Georgian-style architecture. Now, this summer house, which is known as a belvedere, is just a short stroll through these boxwood gardens from the house. And it's one of perhaps only two still in existence in America today.
Visitors to today's Montpelier can't help but being surrounded by history.
Well, in my role as a docent at Montpelier Mansion, I guide our visitors through the mansion and try to give them a taste of the past. We have Montpelier furnished right now to the 1830s. However, the history of Montpelier begins in the mid-1700s with the Snowden family, a very wealthy Quaker family, in fact. The Quakers were rather unusual for their time period because, unlike most of the people in America, they were devoting their lives to religion while most people were here for profit. And the Snowdens were no exception when it comes to profit. They were an extraordinarily wealthy family, owning one of the earliest ironworks in America. And we find that there was a definite conflict between their Quaker virtues and the aristocratic gentry society that surrounded them. We find that the Snowdens were actually asked to leave the Quaker Church, the meeting of friends as it was called, simply because they were too wealthy. They had too much money and they enjoyed spending it a little too much. And we try to point out some of the extravagant items that the Snowdens did have in their mansion as we take the visitors through. It is a surprisingly small mansion when you consider the Snowden wealth, and this may in fact be a reflection of the Quaker doctrines for simplicity and austerity and devoting your life to religion.
Montpelier is a quiet refuge in the ever-changing city of Laurel. Now, Laurel started as a center for ironworks back in 1735 with just a handful of people. The town's original name, Laurel Factory, reflected both its industrial role as well as the beautiful plants that bloomed nearby.
One of the surviving parts of Old Laurel is Main Street. With office towers and new homes getting so much attention, this historic street was fading fast, and by the early 1980s had been largely eclipsed. But the city fathers realized that their thoroughfare could provide what gleaming new shopping centers could not: a link to the past, an emotional reminder of the way we were.
Main Street was really built to take the products from the mill, which were at 9th and Main, where the present swimming pool is, down to Route 1, and then in 1835 down to the railroad tracks. The B&O railroad tracks come through. And between Route 1 and the B&O railroad tracks, that were the major transportation to Laurel, and that's why Laurel flourished. In 1888, Laurel was the largest town in Prince George's County. One factory employed 500 people. And then other factories built up to support that. They had a 5-story stone machine shop, was the best on the East Coast, was right there in Laurel, Maryland. And that supported the mill. And Main Street supported all that. And then today, we have some of the old mill homes still there. Some of the other homes are still supporting Main Street, but all the hotels are gone and all those things are gone. But we're still, we have a historical district there that very particular on what happens on Main Street.
Today's Laurel hums to the tune of new business, largely service industries. The old mills, turning out woolen and cotton fabrics, have evolved into the shopping centers that cover much of modern Laurel. Now, this town's mills are mostly a memory, but just south of here, the town of Beltsville maintains the industrial tradition.
The Beltsville Brickworks, started here in 1928, was a successor to industries long identified with this area. During the Revolutionary War, this site was an ironworks where local iron ore was changed into the ballast of battle. The shot and cannonballs and wheels which powered the militia. Vast amounts of wood were brought to and changed into the charcoal which fueled the great furnaces. Wheelwrights and blacksmiths kept the wagons rolling and the furnaces blazing 24 hours a day.
In earlier days, stagecoach riders passed through great farms en route to Van Horn's Tavern, a local landmark. Well, now today's visitors can see much the same, for just down the road is a rather large farm belonging not to old MacDonald, but to Uncle Sam.
Here at the United States Department of Agriculture, animal and plant research has made life better for all Americans. Among all the improvements that cross our dinner table, perhaps none is quite so appreciated as the famous Beltsville turkey. USDA select breeding provides such big, juicy birds that giving thanks to the scientists should be as much a part of Thanksgiving as the cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie.
If you go back into the 1930s and before, people did not have refrigerators. They had ice boxes. And the big problem was the turkeys were large then. Most turkeys are. And a family of four could not eat one of these big birds and get the remains in that ice box. So they said, well, why can't we develop a smaller turkey with more breast meat? So the Beltsville white, which weighs about 12 pounds, 15 pounds, was developed and had a very large breast, smaller bird, family of four could eat this bird, and what they didn't eat, they could get into the ice box. Beltsville, as a research station, was started in 1910. And we started with a very small area, 475 acres. Depends on how far back you want to go in history. You had, I have collected arrowheads off the point, off the center, and spearheads that Smithsonian has dated for me between 9 and 11,000 BC. So the Indians were there for a long, long time. The original family came from Wales, and their name was Snowden. And basically they were miners. And what they were looking for were these large veins of bog iron, what we call solidified chunks of iron ore. That was one of the few things I think those early furnaces could break down. They just couldn't break down the oxides like our modern furnaces do. So every time they'd find a vein of this, they would dig it out, like we have one right behind the visitor center there at the Log Lodge, and that's an old abandoned iron ore pit. Now the Snowdens came in, and in the first man, they called him Richard the Ironmonger. And in his lifetime, he had an estate in there of 80,000 acres. He owned all of the land from South River right outside of Annapolis to Sandy Springs in Montgomery County. He was right in between Lord Baltimore and Lord Calvin. And then on the center itself, we do have one of the houses that was built for his great-great-great-granddaughter.
Adjacent to the Agricultural Center is a special retreat for animals unknown to many Prince Georgians. The Patuxent Wildlife Research Center is home to many of America's rarest birds and animals. Now, to encourage reproduction of rare birds like the whooping crane and to protect their vulnerable offspring, visits from the general public are prohibited.
Not all of Route 1's history is along the highway. Indians found that the red and blue clays of a nearby stream were perfect for the beauty parlor. Paint Branch is a source of brightly colored Indian ornamentation. Powder Mill Road in the same vicinity was named, as you might expect, for the mill that processed the powder during the Revolutionary War.
In the early days of the century, Mia and I could hop aboard a streetcar and head on down to Hyattsville en route to Washington. That town, Hyattsville, sprang up in the 1860s as the federal government grew larger and larger. Now, the demand for housing was Hyattsville's raison d'etre, its reason for being. The streetcar didn't limit commuters to Hyattsville, however. Those early conductors would call out the names of towns all along Route 1. Next stop, Mount Rainier, or Brentwood. or Cottage City, or Riverdale. Now, these areas, plus those of Langley and Tacoma Parks, are now playing host to some of the county's newest residents. Now, these new Prince Georgians, many of them from Africa, from Latin America, or from the Far East, are changing the face of the county. Neighborhoods are being enriched with new languages, new foods, and new customs. And as these new immigrants bring their talents to bear, they have begun to add their own pages to the county's history.
That's great, Ken, but let's turn back the pages about 100 years or so. The town of North Brentwood was created to honor those blacks who perished in the line of duty during the Civil War. Captain Wallace Bartlett, commander of the 19th Infantry, chose the North Brentwood site for those patriots who made the ultimate sacrifice. It should be noted, however, that the land was on a floodplain and often suffered the hardships of its own geography. In 1924, North Brentwood became the first town in Prince George's County to be incorporated by black citizens.
The land for Riverdale had beginnings that were quite aristocratic. The Riversdale estate was divided up and sold in 1887, with one of the parcels becoming the town. Well, I think it's time for Mia and I to ask the conductor for a transfer because we need to get off at Bladensburg.
I'm not packing any pistols here in Bladensburg, our final destination on this history highway. But back in the 1800s, packing a pistol was almost de rigueur, a requirement of men defending their honor. But before we go to war, let's talk peace. To understand the history of Peace Cross and the mixed blessings of being a port town, Susanna Cristofane looks back at Bladensburg.
Oh, yes. Ocean-going ships came here and loaded their ships with tobacco and took it to England. And we have this little market master's house down here, and he was the master of the ship place down there, the market place.
Okay, we walk 3 paces and shoot.
1, 2, 3. I got you first.
Oh, shucks. We're here at the dueling grounds in Bladensburg. This peaceful scene belies the many tragedies that occurred here in the name of honor. Over 50 vengeful disputes were settled here, many of them with firearms, many of them fatal. One of the most notorious involved James Barron and Stephen Decatur, both of the United States Navy. Now, it seems that Barron was court-martialed for dereliction of duty, and he blamed Decatur for the conviction. Well, Decatur was unrelenting. He rubbed salt into Barron's wounded pride by refusing to restore his naval rank even after the War of 1812 had ended. The festering continued, and their anger intensified.
Barron challenged Decatur to a duel. Records show that Barron was nearsighted, while Decatur was a skilled marksman. To compensate for Barron's handicap, pistols could be set before firing. A date was set, March 22nd, 1820. The terms established pistols at 8 paces. The place designated, the dark and bloody grounds of Bladensburg.
Shots rang out after both men expressed their hope for a better relationship in the hereafter. Decatur fell mortally wounded, and he died later that night after forgiving Barron. Barron was also seriously wounded, but he recovered and lived for 30 more years.
Soon thereafter, in 1839, Congress moved to stop the killing. Dueling was henceforth illegal in Bladensburg and the rest of the nation. But for many, the fatal attraction still continued, with the last duels taking place around the time of the Civil War.
Most people passing through Bladensburg have no idea of the history that's underfoot. Well, in this place, perhaps that's a blessing. But for most of the Route 1 towns in today's show, that's a shame because of the motherlode of Prince George's history all along the highway.
Ken and I are asking that you slow down and explore this microcosm of American history. From industrial sites to farmlands, from grand mansions to famous, sometimes infamous battlefields, Route 1 in Laurel should be, to contradict Robert Frost, the road most taken.
Well, That's Mia.
And that's Ken.
And we're saying goodbye to you
From a lesson in history.